Now time for member questions. I'll start it off. I'm extremely worried that the existing model of U.S. funding for programs in China is going to be impossible to sustain because the recipients of the funds for China have predominantly been U.S.-based NGOs and universities. However, China's National People's Congress is moving ahead with legislation right now called the Overseas NGO Administration Law. Though subject to typically opaque procedures, it seems that this law will block virtually all foreign funding in Chinese civil society and hamstring NGOs operating on the Chinese mainland. How could this law affect States' activities in Greater China, including democracy, human rights, rule of law, and how will State approach China about current deliberation on this legislation? Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Human rights and universal rights, not American values, but universal rights is a major element of our ongoing dialogue with China. In that connection, we miss no opportunity to underscore the importance that we place not only as Americans, but in our partnership and our bilateral relationship with China on the vitality and the ability of civil society to operate freely and to act. We have, from President Obama and Vice President Biden on down, repeatedly made the point directly to China's leadership that NGOs, that civil society, that the free exchange of ideas and the ability of citizens to engage and participate in the political life of the nation is a critical element to sustainable economic growth. We've made the point that for China to avoid the middle-income trap and to move from a manufacturing economy to an information economy, which is what the 21st century requires, it's essential that they allow groups to operate, including and especially NGOs, both foreign and domestic. This is an important part of our dialogue. In terms of funding,
are we communicating that pretty robustly with our counterparts in China?
Yes. I have been in meeting after meeting, as I mentioned, with the President, the Vice President, and the Secretary of State, in which we have emphasized that point. I myself have met with Chinese NGOs during my visits to China. There are areas where the Chinese authorities allow them to operate, but there are constraints. And we believe strongly that the direction that China would be well advised to move in is in loosening, not tightening those constraints. In terms of funding, I'll defer to my colleague, Mr. Stivers. The bulk, though, of the programs that we support are aimed specifically at the communities in Tibet as part of our effort to sustain the linguistic, religious, and cultural traditions there.
If they do pass this law and it becomes imminently more difficult to go through NGOs and universities, do we have a plan B?
Well, we are in discussions. We look seriously at that set of issues. We want to ensure that Chinese universities, students, and groups, including NGOs, continue to have the opportunity to visit the United States, to study in the United States, and that we, as well as international NGOs, can operate to the benefit of the Chinese people as well as the international community.
Thank you. Thank you, Assistant Secretary. I just want to clear up in terms of from USAID's perspective, there is no funding in this budget request for the Chinese government or that would benefit the Chinese government. Certainly they can fund their own development and programs. The funding in this request focuses on Tibetan communities, one of the most vulnerable and repressed populations of the world. And this committee and you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Sherman and Mr. Rohrabacher have really been leaders on that over the years, and I worked a bit on that when I was a staffer in Congress. In terms of that assistance. There is a small amount of health funding that's part of our regional funding, which does affect in southern China. But the funding in this request is for the Tibetan community in the Tibetan Plateau.
Thank you. I'm going to run out of time, but I do have one other question, and it relates to the situation in Hong Kong. The situation in Hong Kong's umbrella movement and the pro-democracy protests of 2014 have evoked worldwide sympathy, but failed to gain true universal suffrage for the chief executive elections. I was there for the handover ceremony. I remember all the promises that were made about one country, two systems, and it's not materializing as it was promised it would. What are we doing with the administration, with State? What are we doing to try to make some headway on that issue? I am very, very fearful that it's going to get more dicey before it gets better.
Mr. Chairman, I've visited Hong Kong. I have met with the senior officials there. We have a very active Consul General, and we engage both in the mainland, in Beijing, and directly in Hong Kong with the authorities and all of the political parties and protagonists, as well as the business community. We have made it clear to the Chinese authorities that the international community and the United States expect them to honor their commitments under the basic agreement. We have made clear that the introduction of universal suffrage is a key element to living up to the promise of one country, two systems. And we've also underscored that the role that Hong Kong plays in the Chinese as well as the international economic community is a function of its tradition of openness and respect for the rule of law. That's a central tenet of Hong Kong's success and therefore of China's success. We believe that a society with the greatest degree of autonomy that listens to the voices of the citizens is going to thrive, and we've made that very clear. Now, it is for the Hong Kong government and the Legislative Council, LegCo, and the people of Hong Kong to decide specifically about the pending proposal from the government with regard to universal suffrage. And so on that score, we will defer to them. But we have made clear the importance that we place on allowing Hong Kong's residents to have a meaningful choice in the selection of their own chief executive.
Pick from some list that Beijing has given them, a list of 3 people that they've determined that they can choose from. We're going on a CODEL in 2 weeks to Hong Kong. Elliot Engel, the ranking member of the full committee, is accompanying me. Mr. Lowenthal, I believe, is as well. And we intend to meet with some of the student protesters and some of the folks that are very, very concerned about the eroding of democracy in Hong Kong, and we intend to make a big issue of it. And we hope that we can work very closely together with State throughout the next weeks and months and years to make sure that we get accomplished what the Hong Kong people deserve and the world deserves. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.